is Sagit Alkobi-Fishman. She has an academic background in computer science, a BA from Technion Israel Institute of Technology, and in philosophy of digital culture and art, an MA from Tel Aviv University. Alkobi-Fishman is a digital artist and a new media scholar, working in her studio specializing in design for the print media and in visual science communication design. Her work focuses on digital and mixed media paintings, via which she explores the influence a medium may have on the creation process as well as on the aesthetic experience. Sagit's journey, expressed through her artwork, embodies various themes as she interests in the intersection between technology and aesthetics, and the questions aroused by technological entities and the realm of the arts. So let us welcome Sagit Alkobi-Fishman. Hello, Sagit.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
In this talk, we will look at a recent artificial intelligence technology that has been applied to the creation of art. All the images you see on the right are examples. We will refer to the grids underlying the technology, and through those grids, we will be led to philosophical difficulties. One central is this: how to understand works generated by or created with the substantial aid of AI systems. Can we reasonably talk about the artist's intentions? What might be an alternative? We will reflect upon a few approaches and arrive at a few intriguing observations. In October 2018, Christie's New York auction house sold this very portrait for nearly $500,000. The portrait is called Edmond de Bellamy, and it is one of 11 portraits composing a sequence of portraits called La Famille de Bellamy, all of which were given birth by AI under the delivery of a Paris-based collective called OVS. This event, along with other events, drew the attention of art critics pondering AI art. The encounter between AI and art has not been new at all, but unlike past encounters, this one resides heavily on machine learning techniques. What characterizes such techniques is that they do not require the formulation of some expert knowledge. Instead, they gain a desired expertise by implicit means of statistics based on vast amounts of data they are fed with. In fact, these techniques mark a paradigmatic shift in all fields of AI. And what has enabled the shift is the increase in computational power, the growing accessibility to data, and algorithmic developments. An algorithmic framework underlying large portion of contemporary AI art, including the Bellamy family, is called Generative Adversarial Network. It was invented in 2014 by Ian Goodfellow, with the goal to teach or train a generative model to generate data that would seem as if they were drawn from distribution represented by some given data set. Thus, given a data set of paintings or, for example, portraits, the algorithmic output is a generative model that ideally knows to synthesize portraits that look as if they were taken from the same distribution. Using the resulted generative model, if one is not pleased with the quality or visuality of the outputs, you may proceed in several ways. For example, continue generate outputs and select those that best fit your goal, or repeat the training phase on a different dataset, possibly larger, while applying the same or different parameters. The user then can determine the degree of her involvement in the creation process by selections and choices, though the system remains autonomous in choosing and generating the specific features composing each of its outputs. From a broader outlook, the process of creation can include additional choices. As you see in the illustration, in this case of Edmond de Bellamy, such choices included the naming of the series that meant to pay a tribute to Goodfellow, the signing of the work by the mathematical formula referring to the theoretical idea of the algorithm, the printing and framing of the portrait. So how GAN does its magic? To train the generative model G, GAN uses another model, a discriminative model D, and trains both models in turns. This goal is to tell apart G's outputs from the dataset S, and G's goal is to fool D. Let's look at an iteration of D. As seen in this illustration, D receives a mini-sample containing items from S and items that were generated by G. For each item, D estimates the probability that it came from S. Using the labels of the mini-sample, a score is computed for D's performance, and D then tunes its parameters so to increase the score. The learning part here is the tuning of parameters. G works in a similar way, and in each iteration tunes its parameters so to decrease D's score. The training ends when G wins, that is, when D cannot tell apart the generated outputs from S. In the visual domain, GAIN typically uses grid-based artificial neural networks as its models. This is because images are spatial data and so represented by grids. As illustrated, the networks consist of layers of arrays of grids of artificial neurons. The use of grids allows us to associate with each neuron a location in the image, and to exploit the spatial structure of the image, each neuron is connected to a small neighborhood in the preceding layer rather than to the entire layer. This significantly reduces the number of parameters that the networks need to learn, and thus machine learning art becomes feasible. The creation process then, when viewed through the prism of technology, amounts to a grid-oriented process wherein every unit in the aesthetic grid, that is, a division of the image into elementary units, is the result of computations undertaken by artificial neurons in the neural grids. When viewed through the prism of art, the creation process, as we saw previously, may be described in terms of selection-based activities done in the GAIN phase, combined with possible post-GAIN activities. We thus far saw that a machine learning technique can be applied to the realm of creation of art. We also were informed that the art market has welcomed this kind of art. Yet the encounter between machine learning and art invites non-trivial difficulties. One such difficulty is the challenge of interpretation. The challenge of interpretation, that is, the challenge of assigning meaning or meanings to a work of art, is not unique to AI art. Works of art are assumed to go beyond the descriptive characteristics in virtue of their being works of art. They thus require interpretation. The question of how to interpret works of art, or where to look for the meaning or meanings, has been debated within both the continental and the analytic philosophical traditions of art. Within the scope of the analytic tradition, which is the focus of this talk, the pivotal question has been the question of whether the artist's intention is relevant to the interpretation of works created by the artist. The idea that the artist's intention might be a significant factor determining a work's meaning has its roots in Romanticism, but through the analytic prism, it has been associated with model of communication. Now think, for example, when wishing to understand someone's deed or utterance, we typically look for that someone's intention in order to reveal the meaning of her deed or utterance. Likewise, when wishing to understand the work of art, it may seem reasonable to go through a similar path. A work of art is analogous to some sort of utterance. But can we speak reasonably about artists' intentions when referring to works generated with the substantial aid of GAIN-based systems? What might be an alternative? Now let us examine this wonder by considering the position known as actual intentionalism while focusing on the art of painting. Actual intentionalism encompasses various views, all of which regard the artist's intention as an important factor in the interpretation process of the artist's artworks. To examine GAIN-based works through this indeed challenging prism, let us assume some version of actual intentionalism by which the artist's intention is a necessary condition for a work's meaning. The first question that might come to mind is who is the artist whose intention might be our object of reference? At the first glance, it seems reasonable to argue that the user of a GAN-based system is not entitled to be called the artist. She has a limited control over the concrete features of a specific output, and she is not the one to actually generate the output. Now recall that every unit in the aesthetic grid is the result of computations undertaken by the artificial neurons in the neural grids, and thus the system lacks actual intentionality. So if assuming the system to be the artist, we are led to infer its outputs are meaningless and therefore cannot be objects of art. But this whole rationale is called into doubt because the human user of a GAN-based system, as we previously implied, might be able to influence somewhat the body of the work, and in particular incorporate intentions into it, even if in an indirect manner, for example, through selections and eliminations she undertakes. Nonetheless, when attempting at understanding specific visual elements in, for example, a GAN-based painting, why, for instance, the composition of Edmond de Bellamy is shifted somewhat upward, or why the image both emerges from and merges with smudged stains of dark colors defining its boundaries but also blurring them, we are left unanswered. This is because the user's actions undertaken throughout a GAN phase often influence the visuality of the system's output as a whole, and can accordingly be guided by intentions aimed at the output as a whole. In particular, the user's intentions cannot be manifested in most concrete features of GAN-based paintings. These are the result of the statistical visuality learned by the generative model, although biased by the user's selections. If the object of interpretation is assumed to be a painting, then at least some of the concrete features call for interpretation. Thus, even if some cluster of cells in the aesthetic grid seems like a brushstroke that calls for interpretation, it is impossible to endow it with meaning by an appeal to the user's intentions. These difficulties amount to what I have defined as intentional gap. It is a gap between the seemingly natural objects of interpretation relative to the art form assumed and the artist's actual intentional space. Now, a similar problem occurred more than a century ago with respect to photography. Once it was detached conceptually from painting and science-oriented documentation, it became possible to explore its unique artistic dimensions and conceptualize it as a new artistic medium. So maybe GAN-based paintings should be considered too as a new art form, and a GAN-based system as a new artistic medium. The transition from medium to an artistic medium is not that trivial. The expressiveness of the medium, of every medium, needs to be explored, and it takes time. But even if such a transition were immediate, if assuming that GAN-based paintings are not paintings, would we not miss the point of training a machine learning model to generate paintings? The difficulties we have encountered can be circumvented if following, for instance, anti-intentionalists who reject the assumption that the artist's intention is of any relevance for a work's meaning. Anti-intentionalists maintain that the appeal to artist's intention in order to extract or assign meaning to a work is either fallacious or irrelevant. If the artist failed to express her intention in the work, then it is a fallacy to ascribe meaning to the work based on the artist's intention. But if the artist succeeded, then the intention is already embodied within the work, turning the intention irrelevant. Rather than appeal to artists' intentions, anti-intentionalists centralize conventions, including language, as a main tool of interpretation. There have been many other views that similarly ignore the artist in the interpretive process, and likewise we can circumvent the previously encountered difficulties by adopting one of them. In the continental tradition, an attack on the centrality of the artist went through structuralism and later post-structuralism reaching its by now iconic peak in Roland Barthes' declaration of the death of the author and Michel Foucault's view of the author as a function. The analytic tradition has displayed a slightly different path, attacking the very idea of intention, as was famously done by Monroe Beardsley and William Wimsatt. Anti-intentionalists of the 20th century rather gave rise to further versions of intentionalism. An intriguing version is the following one. Fictionalist intentionalism does not dismiss the idea of intention per se, but uses it as a methodological principle. The meaning of a work is identified with what the interpreters would understand to be intended by some postulated artist, and based on the work itself. So, it is enough that the interpreter succeeds to construct intentions associated with some postulated artist for the work to be considered meaningful. Through the prism of this view, interpreting again-based painting, such as for instance our Edmond de Bellamy, does not require us to consider it as something other than a painting. Also, the problem of the intentional gap does not arise. An interpreter, for example, can postulate an artist that might have intended Edmond de Bellamy to resemble a gentleman from about 2 or 3 centuries. Possibly with relation to religion, the postulated artist also might have intended the stains of colors from which the figure emerges to convey that Edmond de Bellamy takes part in both the divine and earthly worlds, and maybe tends to the former, as might have been intended by the composition being shifted somewhat upward. The postulated artist might have also intended the mathematical formula that draws reference to Gain algorithm and appears at the bottom right corner in place of a signature to express tension between the past, represented by the depicted gentleman, and the future, represented by the algorithm. Or alternatively, the intention might have been to convey the idea that the algorithm itself created the portrait. This very possibility was the actual intention of Orpheus, who signed the portrait. But it does not matter for the fictionalist intentionalist. Of course, there can be many other reasonable interpretations, and though the question of how to cope with multiplicity of interpretations is not trivial, there are various proposals, for instance, to pick the interpretation maximizing the artistic value of the work. There is something even more appealing when considering fictionalist intentionalism in context of machine learning art. The activity of interpretation, through which the interpreter constructs artists and intentions, can implement a test analogous to Turing test, wherein the postulated artist is a human. Turing, like many thinkers before him, wondered whether machines can think. But unlike his predecessors, he replaced the question, can machine think, with a test that sidestepped the need to define what thinking is and how exactly thinking is done by machines. For a computer to be considered intelligent, it is enough that the computer displays capabilities that fool an intelligent agent into believing the computer to be an intelligent agent too. If employing a Turing-like reasoning, then we do not need to define what intention is or how the computerized system implements intention. In particular, in our story of machine learning art, it does not matter that the grid-based computations do not contain actual intentions. It is enough to imagine that the work was created by some human artist who activated intentions for the system to be considered intentional. Let me conclude then. We saw an example of how a machine learning technique can be applied to the creation of art. This is generative adversarial network. The process of creation consists of grid-based computations and uses selections or choices, among others. These two facets of the technological and the artistic revealed what I have defined as intentional gap. Now, the intentional gap exposes the shift in the role technology plays in art from a passive to an active role. Under fictional intentionalism, it is possible to both assess and interpret game-based works in a reasonable manner while preserving the idea of intention. Fictionalist intentionalism provides us with behavioristic-like test that replaces the question, can machine intend, analogously to Turing test. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sagi. That was fascinating. If you don't mind, we have a question from one of the participants. What do you think about the future of art, considering that nowadays computers can create complex compositions and that there is a complete confusion as to key questions of human motivations and intention?
Can you repeat, please?
Of course. So again, what do you think about the future of art, considering that nowadays computers can create complex compositions and that there is somewhat of a confusion as to key questions of human motivations and intention?
Yes. Well, the future of art, it's not so much the future of art as the future of philosophy of art, since the world of art has been open to accept conceptual art and machine learning art. As I have noted, the art market differs from the world of art. Still, 2 years ago, Edmond de Bellamy was sold for nearly $500,000, and it really marked the beginning of a new era of artificial intelligence art. And the future of art, well, and I will say it again, the future of philosophy of art is that the relationship between the technology and the artist need to be recontemplated, since the traditional role of technology changed. It is no longer a passive tool at the end of the artist. It is a sort of semi-agent, not exactly an agent, as I talked about intention, and it is a matter of perspective, because as I have shown, we may regard an art intentional through the prism of Turing-like reasoning, and it is a matter of our perspective. So the future of art is to continue being open and finding new mediums with computers and with artificial intelligence. And the future of philosophy of art is to recontemplate the relation between technology and art, and also the history of art through the prism of technology. So this whole complex of art and technology needs to be reconsidered through various of fields.
Thank you very much for your reply and for your words. That was fascinating. Thank you, Sagit Elkouby Fishman.